And as I've said before, if you don't agree with any of these things, well, don't agree, but don't tell everybody. We don't want to know. No one's interested. So keep those things to yourself. Now you'll remember that we did a 4 awful tanks thing, or 5 awful tanks, looking at the British tanks. And we thought to make it reasonable, we bring in the foreign ones. But that poses problems immediately. What we've tried to do is produce 5 tanks which were all in the museum here and which were so awful that they qualified. That hasn't been possible. In fact, we've had to bend the rules a little bit to squeeze them in anyway. For a start, they're not all tanks, but never mind. They're all armoured vehicles and they're all in this museum. But 2 of them we're going to have to do using photographs because they don't exist in Britain at all. But that's the reason we've done it, to make it, to give a bit of balance to the thing, really, if you like, so that people can see that Britain wasn't the only country that built awful tanks. It's just that some of these are awful for different reasons. Now I'm making this one my number 5. It's not because there's anything particularly good about it, there isn't, but what I really wanted to do was use it as an example of how so many countries still clung on to the idea of the Cardin Lloyd carrier. Poland, France, among others, and Italy mainly. Italy built about 2,000 of these things, not all with flamethrowers, but they built quite a few of them. And really they were past their prime. They shouldn't have gone into action at all, and that's really the main failing with them. But this is essentially a Cardin Lloyd carrier. It's got the Cardin Lloyd type suspension here. The only difference is that whereas with the original Cardin Lloyd, the 1926 model, the 2 crewmen were sitting either side of a Model T Ford engine, say about 20 horsepower. This thing's got a Fiat engine, a 4-cylinder engine across the back, 48 odd horsepower, and it does make quite a difference in performance. But it can't beat the suspension. This sort of suspension is simply no good for anything but the best quality roads. It gets hammered to nobody's business, and is probably the main failing with these vehicles. Now, as a fighting vehicle, in any case, it's too small. The maximum armour thickness was about 13 to 14 millimetres, which isn't really very much. They weren't that fast, they were quite easy to take out, and of course the armament all points dead ahead, so that there's no traverse for the gun. It gets caught whichever way it goes. A British armoured car could probably take one of these out. It could certainly run rings around it if it didn't do anything else. And that was considered quite a bad thing. But that was, the fact is, the Italians had loads of these and used them in quite large numbers. In fact, so many that when the Italians capitulated and changed sides, the Germans took over what was left and used them as police vehicles for internal security work. And I would think that must have been a come down in the world from whatever they were in before, having to go into one of these things. Now this particular machine, it's a CV335, and it's fitted with a flame-throwing device. Now flamethrowers are quite rare. They're absolutely awe-inspiring for anyone looking at them, quite frightening in many ways, but not really as dangerous as all that. The British flamethrower, the Crocodile, was probably the most lethal. It fired a sort of napalm, really, a thickened sort of petrol fuel which stuck to whatever it was fired at and carried on burning. And you don't want that. But ordinary petrol fired out and set light looks dreadful, great clouds of smoke and roaring flame, but it really isn't that dangerous, unless you get fried by it, of course. But that's the secret of these things. And this Italian vehicle had a trailer on the back, you can see it here, a 2-wheel trailer, carried about 500 litres of petrol. And that would produce a gout of flame for the flamethrower. 500 litres may sound a lot, but it doesn't last very long when you're using a flamethrower. It gusts out of the front in terrific jets and really sort of is used up in no time. And the other thing is that a trailer is really not a good idea behind a tank. I know we fitted it in Britain to the Churchill Crocodile because we had to, there was no alternative. But generally speaking, it inhibits the movement of a tank considerably, and it would really have affected these things quite seriously because they're underpowered as it is. They really are too small and too cramped. It's unpleasant for the people inside, especially in somewhere like the North African desert, and difficult to maneuver because they can't see out clearly, can't see what's coming at them, and generally got wiped out that way. But that's the idea behind these vehicles. They were very low, very compact little vehicles, but they were really from an age before the real tank had been invented. And that's the fault with them. They were not ideal fighting vehicles for the Second World War, and they soon got wiped out. That's the main drawback, really. Now we're looking at the M22, the Locust, and it's an airborne tank. It was designed as an airborne tank, and it's that aspect of it that I want to talk about. The idea was, and it's a crazy idea, was that the tank was going to be flown by the C-54, which is a four-engined troop carrier, if you like, later became a well-known airliner. But that's why it has this amazing system of clevises on the side. The idea was that you drove the tank up to the aircraft, undid the turret, lifted off the turret and slid that inside the aircraft, and then drove what's left, the chassis of the tank, underneath the plane, and it was lifted on four hoists, so that it became part of the undercarriage almost of the aircraft. And it meant, A, that the aircraft had to land at an acknowledged airstrip, not anywhere, and it also meant that the tank had to be put together before it could go into action. For instance, you've got to take the hull here, drive it round to the side of the aircraft, load the turret back on, fix the turret up, and then drive off to where the action is. The fact is you're not going to get there. It's not even worth considering. So that's the negative side of it, really. Otherwise, it was quite a good tank. It was designed by Marmon Herrington Limited, and it has a Lycoming engine in the back, giving it quite a lot of power, and it was quite a neat little tank. The only trouble was it wasn't really fit for operations on a 1944 battlefield, and that's what we did with the few that we had over in Britain. They were supplied to Britain because the Americans never used them in the airborne role that they decided on, and we used them and flew them across the Rhine in Operation Plunder as part of the reinforcement for the parachutists who'd already landed. The idea was that these tanks would come out and they'd provide fire support for the troops. But quite honestly, a light tank like this, small and with only a 37mm gun, is completely a waste of time on a 1944 battlefield with Tigers and Panthers roaming about, and you could see why it was likely to get clobbered. It was, however, a well-designed little vehicle with quite a good suspension. It has, you'll notice, a rod here holding the suspension in place. This was essential because it wasn't, otherwise wasn't rigid enough without that. And with a Lycoming engine in the back and a gearbox at the front, quite a neat little tank in other respects, driving to the front sprocket, as most American tanks were in those days, of welded construction, and it would have, well, a nominal crew of 3. You'd have 2 in the turret and a driver down here who didn't know where he was half the time. But that's the vehicle. But it's really this business of moving it by air. The idea that you could take it to bits, lift off the turret, clip it under an airliner and have that fly to an air base and land, and then go through all the business of putting it back together and getting it into action. That's what's really at fault with this design. And it was never tried that way. It could be done, but it was never used in action in that form at all. When the British used it, we took it over the Rhine in a glider. The glider landed in the middle of the battlefield, and although it wasn't any good for the people inside the tank, they were where the fighting was. They were going to get clobbered anyway, but with that inside, it was fairly effective. But they used them later on. I've seen them being used as runabouts with self-propelled artillery batteries and that sort of thing. And they were used as a commander's tank, so he could do a recce of where he was going and set himself up. So you often saw later in the war, late 1944, 45, you'd see them acting as a support vehicle with a self-propelled artillery battery. After the war, I've even seen one of them in RAF service in the Middle East. And that's quite astounding, but they were there really to frighten people, and they do that all right. It looks quite effective with a gun, but it is only a small tank, quite an ineffective one by 1945 standards. So what I thought I'd do now is the next one on the worst tanks list is the Russian T-35. And I'm particularly looking at the later model, the 1933 onwards model, which was the longer one. And I really want to make that my next most horrible tank, if you like. We've chosen to do it up against the Independent, partly because we haven't got a T-35 here. There's one in Kubinka in Russia, but it's a long way to go just to see one tank. And we've got the Independent here, which some people, most people in fact, outside Russia, say was the inspiration for the T-35. The Russians say no, it wasn't, but we'll argue about that later. The thing is that both tanks have 5 turrets, and it's that, among other things, that makes it nearly as awful as a tank can be, because there's no reason for a tank to have 5 turrets. It sounds great, it sounds as if it's shooting in all directions. Half the time it's shooting in none. But against the Independent, the T-35 was a monster. It was something like 35 feet long. This thing's only 25 feet long. But they were both roughly the same width. And it meant that the T-35 was almost impossible to steer. It's all to do with a thing called the L/C ratio. And that's to do with the width of the tank as against the length of the track on the ground. And if you do that, if you calculate it wrong and get it outside the scale of L/C, which is acceptable, then you end up with a machine that won't steer. Conversely, if you do it the other way round and make the tank too wide for its length, you get a tank that won't go straight. You can't win either way. But that's what happens with this thing. And with the T-35, they found that it was a draw and a half for the crowds in Red Square. When T-35 came rolling down the road, people were overjoyed to see that Russia had produced such a massive battleship of a tank. It had 5 turrets with guns pointing in all directions, and really looked like the bee's knees as far as that was concerned. But in action, and only a few of these were used in action, it was an absolute disaster, largely due to the fact that it couldn't fire its guns when it was moving, not at least with any hope of hitting anything, and therefore you had to stop to fire accurately anyway. The T-35 was armed with a 76mm gun in the turret here, and then it had 4 sub-turrets. At the front, the sub-turret on the left had a 45mm gun. The one on the right, as you're looking at it, had a machine gun only, whereas at the back it was the other way round. What we would call the near side had a 45mm gun. The other turret had just a machine gun, and that was the whole armament of the tank. It had machine guns spread, had machine guns out through the roof for shooting at aeroplanes, a separate one on the main turret as well, and one on the back. So it had machine guns sprouting out everywhere. But they really weren't that effective in action because there's such a lot for the tank to fire at that it misses, and that's the big problem with them. Now, the other thing was it had a much more robust suspension than Independent had. Independent has a coil spring suspension. On the T-35, it had rather like a Sherman in a way, a sort of bogie type suspension, but all hidden behind armour plate, of course. Now, the other thing with the T-35 was it was thinly armoured. It weighed about 45, 50 tons, but because of its size, it couldn't be armoured to the sort of scale that was needed. And therefore, those few that went into action were usually, if they hadn't broken down beforehand, and most of them broke down mainly due to transmission failures, then it tended to be knocked out by the smallest anti-tank gun, could make a hole in it. And that was really no good. It looked threatening, it looked absolutely dreadful when it came into action, but in fact it wasn't much of a risk at all. It had guns firing everywhere, but they couldn't hit anything. And that really made all the difference. The T-35 vanished from the scene. It really was useless as a tank. Probably excellent as a spectacle in something like the Red Square parades, but not as a fighting tank. Absolutely useless. It had a V12 engine in the back, the same actually, not the same engine, but the same size as the engine in Independent, except that in T-35 was about 500 horsepower, drove through a brake and clutch and brake steering system, which had no effect anyway because steering was nearly impossible. But that was how it worked. And that's why, as a fighting tank, I would rate it down pretty low. Well, I know you're not supposed to say nasty things about German tanks, but on this occasion I'm making an exception. I've chosen the JAGDTIGER, which is going to be number 2 on our list. And it's here really to show how you can make a dreadful tank by making it too heavy. This thing weighs about 70 tons. It's actually the heaviest type of tank to see service during the Second World War. And it was so heavy that there were places it couldn't go, many places it couldn't go, and also it was quite slow. It had a theoretical top speed of 23 miles an hour, a lot faster than the old Elephant over there, but still quite slow and really rather a ponderous beast because it's relying on the gun sticking out the front to do the damage. It's got no traverse, more than just a little bit for the gun itself at all, and that makes quite a difference. It was a self-propelled gun. It was designed around the Tiger II. The bottom half is pure Tiger II, same armour thickness. The only difference, and I'll come to that in a minute, is in the suspension. But the top half is different again. It's a very heavily armoured carapace with a 128mm gun sticking out the front, which is quite a powerful weapon at the best of times. One of these things dug in and well defended could hold up a whole armoured division quite easily by itself. The trouble was that they couldn't always do that. They were always breaking down, which is a nightmare with these things. And of course, if they were caught in the open, they were badly knocked about anyway. So that's the disadvantage of having a gun point sticking out forwards. But what I wanted to talk about as well was the suspension, which makes this thing quite interesting. The original Tiger, King Tiger, has a torsion bar suspension, which you would have thought would have been quite adequate for this thing as well. As it happens, Ferdinand Porsche came along. He would interfere if he could, and he advised using his own system, which uses separate bogies of 2 wheels joined by a horizontal torsion bar. The problem is that the whole unit, the whole suspension unit, is attached to the hull by a bracket. And it's that bracket that can make up the weakness. And you'll see there's a suspension unit missing from the left-hand side. It broke. And you can see where it's come off the main vehicle. And that really makes a difference. It means that the whole weight of the vehicle is carried on those brackets and not on the suspension unit itself. Whereas the torsion bar suspension running across the tank carries the whole tank anyway, carries all the weight and doesn't normally come off. So it's a lot more reliable from that point of view. But that's the real difference between this one. That's what makes this vehicle an interesting vehicle in the collection, having that sort of arrangement in it. But with 250mm of frontal armour, it was virtually indestructible. But at the same time, it had to be where the enemy were. It was no good just waiting for them to come, and if it tried to get anywhere, by moving it would break down. Almost invariably that happened. And that is really what's at fault with these things. They're too heavy. We've got other tanks in the museum that are heavier, but thank goodness they were never used in action. But otherwise, it's quite a remarkable vehicle. But from that point of view, from a mobility point of view, you can forget it. It's got no mobility at all. So now we come to the worst horror on my list. This is number 1, the real nasty tank of them all. And the one I've chosen is the ARL-44. It was a French tank, actually designed while the war was on, designed on the quiet really. They didn't want the Germans finding out. And that's one of the reasons it's so awful. The French, they hadn't had anything to do with tanks for 4 or 5 years, except German ones coming around telling them what to do. So they decided to base it on the Char B. That's why we've decided to show it to you from the side of the Char B. There is an ARL-44 in the French Museum at Saumur. There's another one in one of the towns in France as well. So there are a couple that exist. We don't have it, of course. It's an awful tank. You probably wouldn't want it. But because the French hadn't got any tanks of their own, no designs left really, they decided to base it mechanically on the Char B. It had the same suspension and the same tracks. What they wanted to do was make a tank as French as possible, with no British or any other American influence in their design, whatever. And for that reason, they wouldn't adopt a British, American, or even a German suspension system. They would insist on having a French-type suspension system. And that's why they chose the Char B as the running gear for the new tank. And when you think the Char B dates back originally to 1926, that really is going a bit, but that's the way they work things. Now, the other thing was the French had noticed that the British and the Americans hadn't got a really heavy tank, nothing that would stand up against the Tiger II, for instance. We had some guns that would take out the Tiger II, but that's not quite the same thing. They hadn't got a tank that would really slog it out with the Tiger II. So the French decided to build a heavy tank. They hadn't got a heavy tank program lined up for themselves, but they thought they could contribute something to their part in the war by coming up with a heavy tank designed around the Char B. And the one they chose is the one we know as the ARL-44. And mainly by the people that made it. Now, the tank was designed with a smaller turret to begin with an American 75mm gun, but they did away with that. They decided to go for a much larger turret and a 90mm gun. It was modified from an AA gun, in fact, and was quite effective. The trouble was that it was too long. It stuck out at the front, and if they turned the turret round, it stuck out at the back. So what the French did, quite ingenious really, had a system whereby the 90mm gun was retracted into the turret so far that the breech actually stuck out the other end. You undid a hatch in the back of the turret and the breech from the 90mm gun actually stuck out there. And that was how it was transported. It was quite a hefty tank anyway. It weighed about 50 tons, and it had 102mm of frontal armour, so it was quite thick and quite devastating. But the gun apparently didn't always work very effectively, and the turret was cobbled together. They hadn't got any armour in France, and they hadn't got that set up to make it. So they decided to salvage armour from the French battleship Dunkirk, which had been scuttled. And because she'd been scuttled, they were able to get bits off it rather than take it to bits there and then. And they made the turrets from armour they'd taken off the Dunkirk. The drawback was that they didn't weld it very well, and it was quite a crude thing to begin with, but that's how they did it. And you ended up with a tank which had quite an old hull surmounted by what looked like a very modern turret with an effective gun in it. But they were very slow in getting it produced, and in fact by late 1944, early 45, the Germans had been cleared out of that part of France so they could design it in the open, but they were still very slow at getting it produced. And in fact, the war was over long before the tank was available for anybody to use. So the idea was there, but in practice they weren't able to do it. But that's the sort of problem with this thing. Now the other thing was the engine. They wanted an engine of about 500, 600 horsepower. For some reason they didn't want a British engine. The Meteor probably would have done perfectly well, but they decided in the end to take a captured German Maybach engine. It's something they'd done earlier. At the end of the First World War, they'd used Maybach engines in one of their other heavy tanks because they were available. And the Maybach engine was a damn good engine, but probably didn't, the French didn't really want it. They wanted something of their own in there, and they didn't have an engine that would do. So the thing had a German Maybach engine in it, weighed, as I say, 50 tons, and with quite a solid frontal armour. Carried 5 men, carried 2 in the hull, a driver and a hull machine gunner, and 3 in the turret. But it didn't succeed, and the tank lasted only a short while after the war, took part in one of the 14th of July parades in Paris, and then vanished, and no one's seen it since, apart from those that have survived in the museum. So really quite an interesting tank, but a tank that has disappeared from most people don't even know about it. But it did exist after the war, and the ARL-44 as a tank design has got to be the worst of those foreign tanks that I've listed. We've come to the end of these. We've looked at these tanks, and they're my choice of 5 worst foreign tanks. We've done the British ones, now we've done the worst of the foreign ones as well. And only 2 of them, I'm pleased to say, we had to go really make it up as we went along. We used a tank from another place and filmed it against a tank here which was similar to it. But that was all we could do. With the others, we were very lucky that we had those tanks here. And it's very difficult finding a foreign tank which is so awful it ought to be listed. And I've probably done a few which have annoyed people. That's tough. I don't care. But that's the way it goes. And we've just done that really, they're all meant to be a bit of fun anyway. So all I'm going to say is if you can subscribe to YouTube, it's a great help to us. And if you can support us on Patreon, then we're very welcome to see you there. Thanks very much.